Imagine a killer so brazen he didn't just terrify a city, he dictated their behavior. In one of the most bizarre twists in American crime history, this phantom murderer demanded jazz music be played all night long, or else risk a bloody axe attack. But was this terror-inducing figure truly a mad serial killer? Or something far more sinister and organized? Tonight, we'll uncover the shocking clues and chilling connections that point to an answer more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. If you love dark mysteries and horror stories, that's all we do here. So if you're into that, hit subscribe and stick around. Now, let's go back to New Orleans, 1918. Daytime in New Orleans still carried the familiar rhythms. Streetcars rattled along Canal Street, markets bustled, and jazz seeped from open windows. But as dusk settled, a different mood took over. People locked their doors early, double-checked their windows, and gathered in tight groups behind drawn curtains. The city's usual worries faded into the background, replaced by a sharper, more personal fear. Most residents had lived through crime before, but this was different. There was a sense that something invisible and dangerous was moving through their neighborhoods, and it was carrying an axe. The pattern of violence was hard to ignore. Most of the victims were Italian-American grocers, though a few non-grocers, like Anna Schneider and Sarah Lohman, were also attacked. This widened the panic beyond the Italian community, but for those who owned small stores or lived above them, the threat felt especially close. Many of these families had come to New Orleans to build new lives, bringing their traditions, dialects, and businesses with them. They were used to relying on each other, but now, trust was giving way to suspicion and anxiety. By the early 1900s, rumors of organized crime were already woven into the city's fabric. New Orleans was home to the first mafia family in America, established as early as 1879. Grocery stores often served as fronts for racketeering or extortion, and the city's Italian-American neighborhoods had long attracted the attention of groups like the Black Hand. These organizations used threats and violence to control business owners, and stories of mafia feuds and secret payoffs were common. When the axe attacks began, many wondered if this was a new phase in an old struggle, a turf war, or a warning sent to those who refused to pay up. The first confirmed attack happened on May 23, 1918. Joseph and Catherine Maggio were found in their apartment above their grocery store. Joseph's throat had been cut with a straight razor, and Catherine's injuries were even more severe. The brutality shocked even seasoned police officers. At first, detectives suspected a crime of passion, maybe even a family dispute. Suspicion briefly fell on Joseph's brother Andrew, who had taken the razor from his barbershop days before. But Andrew denied any involvement, and with no solid evidence, he was released. This set a pattern that would repeat. Plenty of suspects, but nothing that truly fit. What really unsettled people was the sense that these weren't random crimes. The killer didn't break in by force. He seemed to slip in quietly, often using a skeleton key or finding an unlocked door. The axe used in each attack usually belonged to the victim. These details made the violence feel even more personal, as if the killer was using the city's own routines and habits against its people. A few days after the Maggio murders, police found a message written in chalk near the crime scene. "Mrs. Maggio will sit up tonight, just like Mrs. Tony." The reference to Mrs. Tony likely pointed to the 1912 Sombra attacks, where Anthony and Johanna Sombra, known as Mrs. Tony, had been targeted in a similar way. The message hinted at a connection between the recent murders and earlier mafia violence, making it hard for anyone to dismiss the idea of a deeper, organized motive. No one could say for sure who wrote the message, but its presence only deepened the city's unease. Newspaper headlines fueled the paranoia. Some writers insisted the killer was a madman with no plan, while others speculated about mafia vendettas or extortion gone wrong. Theories multiplied as new attacks occurred. On June 27, 1918, grocer Louis Bessemer and his companion Harriet Lowe were assaulted in their home. Bessemer survived a blow to the head, and Lowe was left with lifelong injuries. Later that summer, Joseph Romano, another Italian grocer, was killed in a similar fashion. Each new attack seemed to confirm that no one was safe. The city's response was desperate and practical. Families bought guns and installed new locks. Some hired night watchmen to keep an eye on their homes and businesses. People took turns staying awake through the night, too afraid to sleep. The Italian-American community, already wary of outsiders, became even more insular. But even those who weren't grocers started to worry, especially after non-grocers like Anna Schneider were attacked. The sense of randomness made the fear spread further. One detail set these crimes apart from anything the city had seen before: the killer's connection to jazz. Rumors spread that the Axeman would spare any home where jazz music played late into the night. The idea was so persistent that during a lull in the attacks, a letter appeared in the newspaper, supposedly from the killer himself. He claimed to be a spirit of jazz and demanded that the city play his favorite music or risk another attack. The letter was strange and theatrical, but it was enough to make families across New Orleans turn up their radios and hire bands for the night. By the fall of 1918, the city's routines had changed. Grocers closed early. Streets emptied out as soon as the sun set. The sound of jazz became a constant, not just in clubs, but in private homes, as if music itself could ward off danger. Despite all the precautions, the attacks kept coming, and the motives remained unclear. Was this the work of a single, unhinged killer, or was it something more calculated? A campaign meant to send a message or settle a score? The uncertainty left New Orleans on edge. Every new theory seemed possible, but none fit all the facts. As the months passed, people began to wonder if the city was facing a phantom, a lone madman, or a mastermind working behind the scenes. The question of who was really behind the Axeman's terror would soon draw the focus to a man who, in life, had stayed mostly in the background. Frank "Doc" Mumfrey's story doesn't begin with the Axeman murders, but with a string of events that cast him as a figure of quiet suspicion in New Orleans' criminal world. He worked as a pharmacist and ran a jazz business that struggled to stay afloat, but arrest records show he also used the alias Joseph Mumfrey. This second identity appears in police files and news reports, often linked to acts of violence and intimidation. One of the earliest incidents tying him to organized crime was the 1908 dynamiting of Charles Graffinino's grocery store. Mumfrey was arrested for this bombing, which targeted an Italian-American grocer in a way that sent a message to the entire community. This wasn't a random act. It fit a pattern of mafia enforcement, public, forceful, and meant to instill fear. A year earlier, the 1907 kidnapping of Giulia Lamanna had shaken the city's Italian-American residents. The crime followed classic Black Hand tactics. A child was taken, a ransom demanded, and threats were left behind. Police suspected that Joseph Mumfrey, another of Mumfrey's aliases, acted as an intermediary in the kidnapping. The methods used in the Lamanna case and the later Axeman attacks shared a focus on terrorizing a specific community and leaving behind a sense of powerlessness. Both crimes signaled that someone was willing to use violence to enforce control and send a warning. Mumfrey's connections extended beyond New Orleans. He was believed to have ties to Vito Giorgio, a Los Angeles-based crime boss who had spent years as a grocer in New Orleans before moving west. Giorgio's reputation was built on racketeering and extortion, and many researchers believe Mumfrey served as an intermediary for him. This meant collecting payments, delivering threats, and making sure that those who refused to cooperate faced consequences. The pattern of targeting Italian-American grocers for violence, whether through bombings or axe attacks, fit with the mafia's methods of keeping their business interests secure. Despite the mounting evidence, Mumfrey's story is full of gaps and contradictions. His aliases, the confusion in police records, and the lack of definitive proof have left the case open to interpretation. Some believe he orchestrated the fear and violence at the behest of mafia leaders. Others think he was simply caught up in a larger wave of crime, a convenient suspect in a city full of secrets. The true identity of the Axeman remains uncertain, But the suspicion surrounding Mumfrey has never fully faded. As the investigation into the Axeman's motives and connections deepened, attention turned to the broader forces at work in New Orleans. The city's reputation for secrecy and organized crime set the stage for a kind of violence that was both calculated and terrifying. Understanding the Axeman meant understanding the world he operated in, a world where lines between business, music, and crime were often blurred. New Orleans birthed America's first homegrown mafia family by the late 1800s. This organization, rooted in the Sicilian society, established as early as 1879, spread quietly through the city's neighborhoods. The mafia's grip wasn't maintained through grand gestures or public spectacles. It worked through everyday businesses, most notably the small grocery stores that dotted the city's streets. These stores, often owned by Italian immigrants, became central to both community life and criminal enterprise. Their owners were expected to pay extortion fees for protection, and those who refused often faced threats or violence. In a city as compact as New Orleans, where word traveled quickly and communities were close-knit, this made grocery stores especially vulnerable targets. The city's Italian-American population had already become familiar with these tactics before the Axeman's crimes began. The Black Hand, a method of extortion imported from southern Italy and Sicily, relied on anonymous letters marked with menacing symbols, a black handprint or cryptic threats, demanding money from the recipient. The consequences for ignoring these demands were severe. In 1910, Joseph Manzilla, a local grocer, received such a letter. He reported it to the police, but his warnings were dismissed. Not long after, Manzilla was shot in front of his store. Incidents like this set a precedent, showing that violence against grocers was not only possible but sometimes ignored by authorities. The fear these tactics created meant families often kept silent, hoping to avoid further trouble. Police records from the period reflect the confusion and uncertainty surrounding the case. Joseph Mumfrey, or Joseph Mumfrey, depending on the source, remains the most frequently cited suspect when it comes to tying the Axeman to organized crime. His involvement in earlier incidents, like the 1908 bombing, adds weight to the theory that the Axeman's violence was rooted in the city's criminal history. Yet inconsistencies in records and the use of multiple aliases make it difficult to draw clear conclusions. The overlap between mafia tactics and the Axeman's methods leaves open the possibility that the murders were part of a broader campaign of intimidation. The city's atmosphere at the time was one of suspicion and secrecy. Many residents, especially within the Italian-American community, were reluctant to trust the police or outsiders. Stories circulated about corrupt officials and hidden alliances, making it even harder to know who could be trusted. The idea that the Axeman's crimes were separate from the ongoing violence of the mafia became less convincing as more details emerged. The fear that kept people silent also allowed the terror to continue. Taken together, these developments suggest the Axeman's terror may have been less a random spree than a blade in the mafia's arsenal. The city's collective anxiety took on a new shape on March 13, 1919, when a letter signed by the Axeman appeared in local newspapers. The letter's arrival was not a quiet affair. It was printed in full, its bold and chilling words spreading across New Orleans and beyond almost overnight. Addressed from hell, the author wrote, "I am a spirit and a demon from the hottest hell. I am fond of jazz music, and I swear by all the devils in the nether regions that every person shall be spared in whose home a jazz band is in full swing at the time I have just mentioned." The warning was clear. On the following Tuesday, at exactly 12:15 a.m., any home not filled with jazz would risk a visit from the Axeman. The letter's language was theatrical and strange, mixing threats with a kind of twisted showmanship. There was no attempt to hide in the shadows anymore. The Axeman's demands were public, specific, and impossible to ignore. Newspapers published every word, and the story quickly became a sensation, not just in New Orleans but across the country. The city, already on edge from months of attacks, now faced a new kind of fear, one that demanded participation, not just vigilance. No one knew what to make of the demand for jazz. It didn't fit the pattern of extortion or revenge that people had come to expect from violent crime. Instead, it felt arbitrary and surreal. The Axeman's letter forced the city to confront the possibility that their tormentor was not only unpredictable, but also enjoyed the spectacle of their fear. The exact time, 12:15 a.m., added to the sense of inevitability. It was as if a countdown had started and everyone had to decide how to respond. The city's answer was immediate and overwhelming. As Tuesday night approached, homes across New Orleans prepared in earnest. Families set up gramophones and kept records spinning well past midnight. In neighborhoods where not everyone could afford a player, people gathered in the homes of those who could. Hundreds of live bands, both professional and amateur, were hired to perform in private parlors, small bars, and dance halls. The city's musicians found themselves in high demand, playing for crowds that were less interested in entertainment than in survival. The night itself was unlike anything New Orleans had ever seen. The sound of jazz filled the air, not just in the usual clubs, but in homes, on street corners, and in every place where people gathered. Some families danced to keep their nerves at bay. Others sat quietly listening for any sign of trouble. The city's dance halls were packed, and even those who had never cared for jazz before found comfort in its rhythms. For once, the music was not a backdrop but a shield. The effect was immediate and striking. That night, as the Axeman's deadline passed, no murders were reported. The city, which had braced itself for violence, found only music and an uneasy sense of relief. The silence of violence was almost as unsettling as the attacks themselves. The absence of bloodshed raised new questions. Had the Axeman really been watching? Was the letter a genuine threat, or had the city been manipulated into a mass display of fear? Some historians believe the letter may have been penned by someone unconnected to the murders, intended only to amplify the panic that already gripped New Orleans. But the impact it had was real. The city's response turned a night of potential terror into a strange, collective act of defiance. For a brief moment, jazz united the people of New Orleans, even as it reminded them how vulnerable they were. The letter's true purpose remains debated. If the Axeman was tied to organized crime, the spectacle of the jazz ultimatum could have served as a distraction, drawing attention away from more calculated motives. By turning the killer into a mythic figure obsessed with music, the letter may have helped mask the realities of mafia violence and extortion. On the other hand, if the letter reflected the killer's actual mindset, it revealed a person who reveled in psychological power, capable of bending an entire city to his will, with a few lines of print. Whatever the intent, the letter transformed the Axeman from a faceless murderer into a legend. The fear he inspired was no longer confined to the victims' families or neighborhoods. It belonged to the whole city. The psychological toll lingered long after the music stopped. People wondered if they had truly been spared, or if the Axeman was simply waiting for the next opportunity. The events of that night left New Orleans with more questions than answers. Was the jazz letter a sign of the Axeman's real identity, or just a clever ruse to distract the public? Did the silence that followed point to a deeper strategy, or was it a coincidence? The city would not have to wait long before the Axeman returned, and the sense of safety provided by one night of music quickly faded. The next attack would bring the terror back into sharp focus, and the trail would soon grow cold once more. The events of October 27, 1919, marked a turning point in the Axeman's story. That night, Mike Pepitone, an Italian grocer, was attacked in his home while his family slept nearby. Esther Pepitone, his wife, was awakened by a sudden noise and went to investigate, only to find her husband brutally beaten. The scene was chaotic. Blood covered the walls and even splattered onto a painting of the Virgin Mary. Esther later told police she saw a large man fleeing the room, but she couldn't give any more details about his appearance. Unlike some earlier attacks, reports from the Pepitone murder suggested a metal pipe or iron bar may have been used instead of an axe. There was no weapon left at the scene. The killer seemed to have entered in a way consistent with previous cases, chiseling through a door panel rather than forcing entry outright. These details pointed to a familiar pattern, but also introduced new uncertainties. The weapon varied, and the lack of clear evidence led some to wonder if this was the work of a copycat, or if more than one person had adopted the Axeman's methods. The attack on Mike Pepitone was the last killing officially attributed to the Axeman. As with earlier victims, The focus was on the man of the house, while others inside were left unharmed. The police found themselves with few leads. Esther's description of a large assailant was too vague to be useful, and the crime scene offered little that could point to a specific suspect. There were no fingerprints, no witnesses who could place a suspect at the scene, and no confession ever surfaced. The murder left the community shaken, but the investigation quickly stalled. In the months that followed, the city waited for another attack, but none came. The pattern of violence that had haunted New Orleans for over a year seemed to stop as abruptly as it had begun. People speculated about what had caused the killings to end. Some believed the Axeman had left town, perhaps moving on to another city. Others whispered that the killings had accomplished their purpose, whether that was to send a message, settle a score, or enforce some unwritten rule. There were even those who thought the Axeman had died or been imprisoned for another unrelated crime. The lack of answers only deepened the mystery. For Esther Pepitone, the aftermath of her husband's murder brought more uncertainty. She eventually remarried, taking the name Esther Albano. Her new husband, Angelo Albano, had reported business ties to Joseph Mumfrey, one of the main suspects in the Axeman case, also known as Frank Doc Mumfrey. The connections between these men and the broader Italian-American community in New Orleans suggested that the story might have roots in organized crime. After their marriage, Esther and Angelo moved to Los Angeles, perhaps hoping to leave the violence behind. But the past seemed to follow them. In October 1921, Angelo Albano disappeared without explanation. The details of his disappearance remain unclear, and no official resolution was ever reported. 2 months later, on December 5, 1921, a dramatic event unfolded. Esther shot and killed Joseph Mumfrey in Los Angeles, claiming he was responsible for the murder of her first husband, Mike Pepitone. According to some accounts, she believed Mumfrey had continued to threaten her and her family, leading her to seek revenge. However, the story of Esther's confrontation with Mumfrey is clouded by conflicting evidence. Some researchers have noted that contemporary Los Angeles press coverage does not confirm the event under those names, and public records are either missing or inconclusive. This has led some historians to argue that the story may itself be part of the Axeman legend's echo, a tale that grew in the retelling, fueled by fear and rumor. Even Mumfrey's obituary described his death as an unsolved murder, with no clear link to the New Orleans killings. The possibility remains that Esther acted on suspicion or desperation, rather than hard evidence, and that her claim was never fully investigated. Back in New Orleans, the absence of new attacks after Pepitone's death left the police with little to do but speculate. Newspapers ran stories about mafia feuds and mysterious strangers, but no new leads ever emerged. Theories circulated, ranging from the Axeman being a lone madman to a disciplined enforcer working for a criminal organization. The lack of physical evidence or reliable eyewitnesses made it impossible to reach a definitive conclusion. With Mumfrey dead and no new Axeman attacks, the trail went cold, leaving us to wonder if justice was served or if the true mastermind escaped forever. The questions left behind by the Axeman of New Orleans have never been answered. Each new detail seems to open another door, but none have led to a clear resolution. The city, and those who study its darkest mysteries, are left with a case defined by uncertainty. Even now, the story remains open-ended, inviting speculation and debate. The facts are few, the theories many, and the truth remains elusive. The legacy of the Axeman endures, not just in the records of unsolved crime, but in the persistent sense that something important has been missed. The next chapter is full of theories, clues, and unanswered questions that keep the mystery alive. When people look back at the Axeman of New Orleans, they find themselves sorting through a handful of theories, each with its own set of clues and contradictions. The case remains unsettled, not just because of the violence, but because every explanation seems to leave something out. To make sense of the mystery, it helps to break down the main possibilities that have kept investigators and the public guessing for over a century. The first theory is that the Axeman was a lone killer, driven by personal rage or deep psychological disturbance. This idea finds its strongest support in the brutality of some attacks. Take the murder of Catherine Maggio, for example. She was nearly decapitated, and the level of violence far exceeded what was needed to kill. The scene suggested a kind of overkill that points to personal anger or a compulsion rather than a calculated hit. The cryptic chalk message left near the Maggio home, "Mrs. Maggio is going to sit up tonight just like Mrs. Tony," adds to this impression. It feels like the work of someone who wanted to taunt the police and the community, leaving behind messages that only deepened the sense of chaos. The strange, theatrical letter to the newspaper, full of talk about jazz and spirits, doesn't fit the usual pattern of organized crime. Instead, it hints at a killer who wanted to be seen, to be remembered, and perhaps to terrify for the sake of terror itself. The second theory focuses on the possibility that the Axeman was not acting alone, but as an enforcer for the mafia. The repeated targeting of grocers, sometimes using their own household axes or tools, fits a pattern of mafia intimidation, making an example of those who resisted or failed to pay up. The calculated entry methods, like chiseling door panels, suggest knowledge of the victim's routines and a methodical approach. Some historians argue that the Axeman was not a single person, but a symbol for a wider campaign of mafia violence, with attacks carried out by different enforcers as needed. The third theory is more unusual, but just as persistent. The idea that the Axeman's reign of terror was a calculated ploy by someone looking to profit from fear, possibly tied to the city's jazz scene. This theory often centers on Frank "Doc" Mumfrey, a pharmacist and jazz promoter whose business struggled until the Axeman's letter appeared in the newspaper. The letter, demanding that every home play jazz music to avoid death, led to a citywide jazz celebration. In the days following, Mumfrey's jazz venue reportedly saw a surge in business. The timing is suspicious, and some researchers believe the letter may have been written to create panic and drive customers to local clubs. The Axeman's demand for jazz didn't fit with the mafia's usual tactics, but it did turn the killer into a legend and gave the city a night unlike any other. The spectacle may have distracted people from more practical motives, like extortion or business rivalry, by turning the violence into a kind of performance. Media coverage played a central role in shaping all these theories. Newspapers published the Axeman's letter in full, making it a sensation overnight. Headlines focused on the most dramatic aspects: phantom killers, supernatural threats, and the city's desperate response. The press helped turn the Axeman from a criminal into a mythic figure, and in doing so, may have obscured more mundane explanations. The focus on the jazz letter and the idea of a killer obsessed with music made it harder for investigators to keep public attention on organized crime or the everyday realities of extortion. The case became a story, and the story took on a life of its own. Researchers today continue to sift through old police files, newspaper archives, and family records, trying to connect the dots. Frank "Doc" Mumfrey remains a person of interest, with links to earlier crimes like the Lamanna kidnapping and ties to known mafia figures. His movements between New Orleans and Los Angeles, and his eventual involvement in the Pepitone case, add to this suspicion. Still, the evidence is incomplete, with aliases and missing records making it hard to prove anything definitively. The cryptic chalk message near the Maggio murder scene, referencing Mrs. Tony, hints at a longer pattern of violence, possibly connecting the Axeman's attacks to earlier disputes among Italian-American grocers. If these murders were part of an ongoing struggle, the story stretches back further than most realize. Each theory has its strengths and weaknesses. The lone killer explanation fits the brutality and theatrics, but struggles to explain the focus on grocers and the ties to organized crime. The mafia theory matches the pattern of victims and the history of extortion, but doesn't account for the jazz letter's bizarre demands. The jazz profiteer theory connects the cultural impact and economic motives, but relies on circumstantial evidence and leaves many details unexplained. No single theory resolves every detail. So which do you believe? Let us know in the comments. As we look at the Axeman's shadow over New Orleans, one thing is clear. The case is about more than just unsolved murders. One detail that lingers is how jazz, already part of New Orleans culture, became forever linked with the Axeman's legend. After that infamous letter, the music wasn't just entertainment. It was a shield, a sign of hope and a reminder of the fear that once gripped the city. Even now, the story of the Axeman is told alongside the sounds of jazz, each amplifying the other's mystery. If this deep dive unsettled you, hit subscribe and ring the bell for more true crime mysteries. Could the Axeman still haunt those alleys as jazz squeals through the night? Only history knows.